Chapter 25. A Crash and a Bang. They all followed... Chapter 25. A Crash and a Bang. They all followed Sebastian through the dark, winding tunnels of Slabhenge's twisting corridors and staircases. It wasn't clear where they were going, or even if Sebastian had a destination in mind. But whenever Sebastian came to a choice between two halls, he chose the darker and narrower one. Whenever he had to choose between staircases, he chose down. In a winding, candlelit line, they passed through the dip that went by the hatch. It was only feet away, down that last cramped stairway and around a corner. It was a riot of violent, eerie noises, louder than Jonathan had ever heard it. Bangs and shudders and thirsty slurps and the high, pained squeaking of straining iron. Some boys slowed down on the landing that led down to the hatch. Most shivered and sped up. Finally, they came to a dark little windowless room, small and wet and cold at the bottom of a crumbling staircase. It was an especially desolate and forgotten corner of the madhouse island. Rats hurried out as the boys came in with their splashing feet and flickering flames brushing past their feet, causing some boys to cry out and jump. Altogether, the group nearly filled the room. The ceiling was low and dripping green slime. Even here, though, they could hear the storm raging away beyond the thick stone walls that surrounded them. It sounded far and angry, and above them like they were below ground. "Here we are," Sebastian said with satisfaction. "It's perfect." The last kids in were Benny and James. Benny had a rope over his shoulder and a sack in his hands. James was carrying a wooden chair. Sebastian took the chair and set it in the middle of the little floor. Its legs wobbled on the uneven stone. Colin was thunked down in the chair and tied firmly to it with the rope. "Make sure it's good and tight," Sebastian said. When the knots were all tightened and Sebastian had checked them, he stood back and looked at Colin. "You wanted to sneak around and steal like a little rat. Fine. Benny came up with the perfect punishment. You get to spend the night with the rats. All by yourself." Colin was panting, his forehead beaded with sweat. He pulled against the ropes binding him, but there was no give. "The bag, please, Benny," Sebastian said, holding out his hand. He reached inside and pulled out a handful of something. "We want to make sure the rats know who their new roommate is here," he said, holding his hand up to the light. It was full of crackers and bits of cheese from the kitchen. Looking Colin in the eye, he scattered the food around Colin on the floor. He reached into the sack for another handful and tossed it on the floor leading to the stairs. Pulling out one more handful, he crumbled it together in his hand and sprinkled it into Colin's lap. The boys all stood in silence, watching wide-eyed. "That should do it," Sebastian said, rubbing his hands on his pant legs. "You should have lots of little friends tonight. Come on, let's go." "You're just gonna leave me here?" "You got it. Not forever. One long night ought to be enough to teach you a lesson, I think. We can talk more in the morning, you and I." The rest of the boys were already starting to plod back up the stairs. No one said a word. As each kid left with his candle, the room got darker and darker. The last ones left were Sebastian, Benny, Jonathan, and the two goons holding him. "Aren't you going to leave me a light, at least?" "Oh, sure, Colin, here you go." Sebastian took a candle from one of the kids leaving and held it out toward Colin. His fingers opened, and the candle fell to the floor. It sputtered and hissed and went out in a puddle. "Oops, sorry about that." "Good night, Colin." "Sebastian, seriously, you can't," Jonathan began. Sebastian's head swung like a hunting panther to Jonathan. "I can, Johnny," he seethed. "I can. You had your chance. You picked your side. You'll get yours after dinner, don't worry." Jonathan struggled against the boys holding him, but it was no use. He was dragged up the stairs behind Sebastian and Benny and the last candle. The last he saw of Colin, he was sitting in the growing blackness, eyes wide and lips trembling, all alone. Jonathan tried to pay attention as they made their way back to the dining room. At one point he thought they were close to where the library was, but they never saw it. The hatch, when they passed it, was making an unholy racket, like an army of watery demons on the other side, raging to get in. No boys paused to listen this time. They all stopped cold when they got back to the dining room. There were no longer puddles in the room. The entire floor was under an inch of water. It was black and dappled by rain blowing in through the window. The light of the candles still burning on the tables was reflected eerily in its surface. Lightning crackled, filling the windows with blinding light. There was a great boom of thunder that made them all jump. "No letter writing tonight," Sebastian said, looking at the flooded room. "We can do it first thing in the morning, after the storm. Dinner time." Sebastian, this isn't okay," David said cautiously. "It's fine. A little water won't hurt us. It's just 'cause the window's broken." "Where are we going to sleep, man?" Walter asked, pointing at their waterlogged mattresses still lying on the floor. "You can bring your beds upstairs for tonight. There's plenty of room." "Sebastian," Jonathan said, "remember what Patrick said about the storm and the surge and—" "Shut up, Jonathan! No one cares what Patrick said! Don't piss me off. I'm still deciding what your punishment is." He looked at Gregory and Roger. "One of you keep your hands on him at all times. I know the little punk will run away to save his little friend first chance he gets." They ate dinner sitting on the tables, their feet on the chairs. The storm was so loud they couldn't talk over it. They kept having to relight their candles, blown out by the hard fists of gusting wind that hammered through the room. Jonathan sat where Sebastian had been carving with his sword a couple of days ago, flanked by a guard on either side. He fingered the crudely notched letters Sebastian had inscribed on the wooden tabletop. Scars. He looked around at the soggy boys glumly eating, shivering and soaked, sitting in near darkness with rain blowing in the broken window. His mind kept circling around Colin, bound in blackness, swarmed by giant rats. He couldn't swallow a bite. "We need to keep the furnace lit," Sebastian shouted over the storm. "Jonathan, it's your turn. You two go with him." He tossed a stale roll to Roger. "You give that to our prisoner. Don't untie him, though." Jonathan managed to eat a dry bite of bread and slumped down to the coal room, Roger and Gregory right behind. Patrick was tied to his chair in the middle of the room under a dangling lantern, surrounded by piles of coal. The furnace glowed and hissed behind him. His face was grim and he was drenched in sweat. Jonathan gasped and unbuttoned the top button of his own shirt. He'd forgotten how hot it was in the dark little cellar. There was a large puddle at the foot of the stairs. Jonathan frowned. He didn't remember the coal room having any puddles. "Have you come to your senses, then?" Patrick asked. "We're just here to feed the furnace," Roger said. "Here." He held out the roll. Patrick looked at it, his hands tied behind his back. You'll have to untie me." "No way," Roger answered. He tore a chunk off the roll and shoved it into Patrick's mouth. "Get to work, Jonathan," he said over his shoulder. "I don't want to be down here forever." Jonathan was looking at the puddle on the ground. It was spreading and growing as he watched. He looked closer and saw the little rivulets of water running down the stairs along the wall. "Water's getting down here," he said, pointing. "From upstairs." "Who cares?" "Well, that means... Look, just get to work, okay? I'll help." Jonathan and Gregory started shoveling coal into the wheelbarrow while Roger fed Patrick bites of roll. "You boys are crazy," Patrick said when they stood gasping for breath after dumping the first load into the fiery furnace. "You can't keep going like this. You need to get out of here." "Quiet," Roger said. "We're fine." "What happened to your nose?" he asked, looking at Jonathan. Jonathan sniffed and touched it gingerly with sooty fingers. It was still sore. "Nothing. Just an accident." "Aye," Patrick said quietly. "I bet plenty of accidents happen around that boy with the sword." "Come on, keep shoveling. I want to go to bed." They were just about to open the furnace doors for the second load of coal when they heard the crash from above them. More than a crash. A shattering, shuddering explosion that echoed down the stairs. They froze in mid-motion, then turned to look at the staircase. There was a moment of near stillness. Then the water trickling down the sides of the stairs increased to a steady stream an inch deep from wall to wall, water falling into the coal room in dirty little cascades. "What the hell?" Patrick breathed. From upstairs came the sound of screaming. Jonathan and Gregory dropped their shovels and all three boys tore up the stairs at a run. "Wait!" Patrick called. "Don't leave me down here!" But they were already gone, up the stairs and through the kitchen and into the dining room. The room was in chaos. The storm, which had already seemed impossibly fierce, was doubled in strength and fury. All the windows had blown out, every single one, and the door was ripped off its hinges, leaving one whole wall open to the raging wind and rain. All the candles were out, leaving the room in darkness except when it was lit by flashes of lightning. The boys were all huddled behind tables. Jonathan, Roger, and Gregory stopped in their tracks. The water in the room was no longer an inch deep. It was over their ankles, and rising. "Look at that!" Miguel shouted over the thundering storm. "In the courtyard!" Ducking heads peeped from behind the tables. Jonathan's eyes peered through the pelting rain into the darkness beyond the glassless windows. For a moment there was only wet, howling blackness. Then a bright white strobe of lightning lit the scene, and he saw it. A boat, drifting in the courtyard, sailing and bobbing right in the middle of the school. Jonathan and Sebastian and a few others ran to the windows, standing a couple of cautious steps back and squinting into the darkness outside. Lightning flashed again. "It's empty! That's the mailboat, the one the guy came in. The gate must have blown open." Jonathan looked down the row of terrified faces. "It's floating out there," he said. "There's enough water inside for it to float." They looked out at the boat, rocking its way through the storm toward them, rising and falling with the waves. "It ain't just puddles out there," Walter said. "It's flooded. This island's underwater." They looked down at the water, now above their ankles. From behind them came a wrenching, shrieking sound, followed by a thunderous bang. It rang out from the doorway that led into Slabhenge, and for a moment overpowered even the sound of the storm raging around them. Jonathan splashed through the water to the doorway. He took one step into the lightless corridor and listened. He heard echoes of banging and rushing and a wet, slurping roar. "It's the hatch!" he screamed, the wind whipping the words out of his mouth. "It opened!"